Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me. And it's great to see you all, especially for this special salute to our veterans with the classic film, The Best Years of Our Lives. Darnice is taking the night off, but we're delighted to have Veronica filling in for us. Veronica, welcome, and thank you so much. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank anyone in our audience tonight who has or continues to serve our country and their spouses. This discussion is dedicated to you and all of our veterans, so thank you. Thank you very much. This is a movie I have been trying for years to get the rights to show at the library. I've been trying for 5 years to get the rights to this, and I won't bore you with the details, but I never could get permission to show this film in person at the library and talk about it, beside the challenging fact that it's 3 hours long. So I was delighted when this finally popped up on Canopy, and as soon as it did, I scheduled it for the 13th today that we're going to talk about. So I'm so delighted that we're going to get to finally watch and talk about The Best Years of Our Lives. So unless anybody has any questions, I'll get right into the discussion. So are there any questions? Okay, great. So we do need some background for this film, especially for one that's 3 hours long, and I'll try not to go that long. So we have a wonderful book at the library called Five Came Back, written by Mark Harris. There's also a documentary with that same title. I don't think we have it, but I'll see if we can get it. So Five Came Back takes a look at 5 movie directors who either served during World War II, filmed various aspects of the war, or both. Those directors were John Ford, Frank Capra, John Huston, George Stevens, and the director of tonight's film, William Wyler. Now, Wyler was a very successful director before the war, directing such films as The Letter, The Little Foxes, and Mrs. Miniver, to name just a few. After the war, Wyler owed MGM one more film on his contract. Now, Wyler wanted to make something that shared his war experiences, and he had already gotten a script called The Way Home, which was a story about men returning from the war. That script had been sitting on the shelf at MGM for quite a while, but Samuel Goldwyn told Wyler, look, the war's over. Why don't you make something light and funny? That's what people want to see after a war. But Wyler persisted, yet there was something about the script that wasn't working. So he hired McKinley Cantor, a novelist and a scriptwriter, to work on the project. Now, Cantor was a war correspondent, and he had interviewed many GIs, so he knew what these men were like, but his script was far too dark, too harsh, and too explicit. To give you an idea, in his script, the character of Fred slept with just about every woman he could find. Al was haunted by the child prostitution that he saw during the war, and Homer commits suicide. Not exactly an uplifting type of movie. So in comes screenwriter Robert Sherwood, who spent the war years in the Roosevelt administration trying to shape public opinion about the war. But he also wanted to honestly portray the problems that returning veterans faced. The Best Years of Our Lives gradually evolved into William Wyler's own story. Now, Wyler flew missions over Italy during the war, and he was able to identify with all 3 major characters. So you've got Al, a man with a good job and a loving family, returning home to discover you can't walk back into your old life quite so easily. And then there's Fred, who's haunted by the war, and Homer. And since Wyler returned from the war with his own disability, deafness, which lasted for several years, he could relate in many ways to Homer. Speaking of Homer, in the original script, he was a character who suffered from a neurological condition called spasticity. Now, that character was going to be played by an actor named Farley Granger, who, if you're familiar with him, very handsome actor. But Wyler insisted on an actual veteran with a real disability to play the part. Now, Weiler visited a number of veterans hospitals and finally found the man he wanted in a short film he saw about the medical care being given to returning veterans. Now, in that film, he saw a 30-year-old soldier whose hands had been accidentally blown off in a training exercise involving TNT. Now, the soldier in that film wasn't even named, but Weiler tracked him down and found Harold Russell and convinced him to take the role of Homer. Now, the only problem with Russell was he was untrained as an actor, had no experience whatsoever. But Weiler had worked with some of the finest actors in Hollywood, so this was a bit of a challenge. But he told Russell, look, nobody knows this character as well as you do. Just be yourself. And that's exactly what Russell did. He also won 2 Oscars for his performance, for Best Supporting Actor and an honorary Oscar for bringing hope and courage to his fellow veterans. This was the first and only time an actor has won 2 Oscars for the same role in the same film. And it was also the first time a non-professional actor had ever won an Oscar. Now, you might have noticed that Weiler chose characters from different branches of service and different backgrounds. So we have Al, who is a well-to-do Army sergeant. We have Homer, a sailor with a middle-class background. And we have Fred, a captain of the Air Corps, a man from the wrong side of the tracks. So Weiler wanted to appeal to as wide an audience as possible with these 3 characters, trying to have someone that everybody could relate to. Now, one of the big problems this film had was with the production code. They had a lot of issues with this film, requesting 8 single-spaced pages of changes. Things like insisting that Al and his wife Millie sleep in twin beds. After a long war, I don't think so. But what terrified the production code more than anything else was the scene in which Homer removes his hooks just before bedtime. Now, most American civilians had never seen such a thing. But again, Weiler, a veteran himself, insisted on the realism. So when this film was released, critics and audiences loved it. Billy Wilder called it the best directed film I've ever seen in my life. Wow. The film won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture. And at the time, The Best Years of Our Lives was the 2nd highest grossing film in history after Gone with the Wind. There are so many things to say about this film. So who would like to start? Okay, Veronica's looking for hands, but okay.
So
There you go, Bob. I unmuted you. You're good.
I wanted to say this one thing because I thought the crushing irony of this film is that they give the title words "the best years of my life" when she said it to the adulterous wife of Marie, and I thought you couldn't have anything more ridiculous come out of that woman's mouth when we're talking about these 3 veterans. I thought it was perfect.
You're right, Bob. It's a real slap in the face, isn't it, to the men who actually went through the hell they went through. Yeah, great point. Let's see, Veronica, who did we have next?
We actually have Jan real quick. Jerry chimed in the chat and she said, I was surprised that there was not a hero's welcome at the airport for the 3 servicemen, but it was good they had met up.
That is a great point, and we will get to that in just a moment if you'll remind me about that. Okay, and who was next?
It was Jan.
Oh, okay. Well, as a classic film lover, I've seen this before. However, I was awestruck watching it this week, and I probably because I'm older and in the times we're in right now. So for 2 reasons, and we can discuss at, whenever. But one, Peggy is my mom. When I Googled Teresa Wright, they're similar in age, 26, not married. And I remember my mother talking back then, she was ancient because she wasn't married at that age because of the war.
Yeah.
And then for the second reason, and this struck me at the very end, and I'm not going to get political here, but in the times we're in where everybody is so divided, the scene near the end where Fred fights the guy who kind of took on Homer in the pharmacy.
Yeah, the soda shop pharmacy.
And
Yeah.
where you think about, you know, the end of the war, everybody came home exuberant, the baby boomers were being born, i.e. me. But not everybody felt that way. And I don't think we've heard that much, or at least I haven't, about any discourse about during these times. And I was really struck by it this week. So those were my two immediate impressions after watching the movie this week.
Okay, very good. Let's see, who do we have next? Veronica
We're
was,
gonna have Bill Bates
okay,
and then Gary Blitz.
okay.
Yeah, great choice, Andy. This is one I'd seen many years ago, but it's obviously the perfect Veterans Day movie. William Wyler does just such a nice job and tackles it with grace, very classic. It's obviously a film that I think probably one of the reasons it was so popular was it was surprising how honest it was, and I'm sure that there were so many people that it touched directly in terms of the stereotype is, oh, the returning conquering heroes and everything goes great, and there were so many veterans that came back right after the war that had these kinds of obstacles that they had to get by, and people that knew people like that. I was particularly struck in this film by, I love Greg Toland's work, the deep focus photography, like Citizen Kane, et cetera. And there were a few scenes where he used that to the nth degree. And one of the most beautiful single shots I've ever seen that really conveyed, not only beautifully composed, but it really conveyed so much in the shot, was right almost at the very end when Dana Andrews is looking at Teresa Wright over the shoulder of Harold Russell and Wilma. And you see everybody framed in that shot, and you know exactly where his focus is. And you get the juxtaposition of those two relationships, the Wilma Harold and the Teresa Dana Andrews, and the ironies there, et cetera. One last thing I'll just throw in. I was very fortunate in years ago when I was still working at the U.S. Department of Labor. One Veterans Day, Harold Russell showed up to be our speaker. So I had a chance to meet him. Really classy guy, a wonderful speaker. And so that was a real highlight for me. I think that may be the only Oscar winner, and certainly the only double Oscar winner I've ever met in person. So.
Wow, what a great story. What a great story. Let's see, Veronica, I think Gary was next. Is that right? Okay, Gary?
Yeah, I wonder if this is part of Wyler's plan to sort of have wide appeal with the characters. I've always found it interesting that the well-to-do, high-ranking banker was the sergeant.
Yeah.
And the guy on the wrong side of the tracks is the captain.
Yeah.
That's sort of a reversal, of the power dynamics in civilian life versus military life. And sort of curious what you know about the decisions around the different ranks that he gave those two guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. It really is a leveling in some ways, but in other ways, you've got these ranks, and even if you're not in the military, there are certain ranks in status. So yeah, great point. Veronica, who we have next?
You had wanted to say something.
Okay. Yeah, Sue, unmute
Okay,
yourself.
all
There
right.
you go. You went back to muting, Sue.
Right. Okay. So I was really taken because I had seen so many war movies where all these guys were heroes and somehow everything came out wonderful and it, you know, it never dealt with the real pain that people dealt with. And I thought it was just amazing, amazing movie in that it really dealt with that. And I also saw that Captain Sergeant thing. I'm like, what? The guy's a banker. They don't make them sergeants. And the other thing is, I just loved Homer's was it Homer? No, Harold's Boston accent
Yeah.
in a Midwestern town. But I got used to it.
Yeah. Well, now a couple of you have brought up the fact that how veterans were treated, and you know we've all seen movies where the veterans come home and they're the hero. But even early on, when we see that scene right at the beginning at the airport where Fred is trying to get home and he's in his uniform, and there's this other guy that's, you know, obviously a stuffed shirt that has no regard for the man's uniform and feels like he can buy his way out of anything, and even says it's no problem for me to pay the excess baggage fee. And then there's the guy at the soda counter later on. And for those of you who know more about World War II than I do, which is probably everybody, I do know that before Pearl Harbor, there was a huge idea of isolationism for America. And I was wondering if Wyler was maybe trying to touch on that, or just trying to say, you know, the veterans should be treated better than what I'm seeing, because Wyler again was a veteran himself. So let's talk a little bit about that, about what you think it was like then, and what do you think the audience reaction was to the way Wyler presented veterans?
Jan was first, and then we'll hear from Jim.
Well, Andy, I know less than you about World War II,
I
but
don't know.
I have, so I certainly know more about Vietnam vets coming home and how they were treated and how they have felt. There's been much more printed, verbalized than that. I really wasn't aware of too much of World War II vets coming home. My impression is what I alluded to before. Everything was wonderful. The world is, you know, the wars are over, the pictures in Times Square of the soldiers kissing nurses and the whole bit. You really didn't hear too much. Even my father, who fought in World War II, every you know, I didn't hear too much. So this was a bit of a revelation to me. But that's all I'm going to say, because maybe there's others who know more. I've certainly heard it about the wars subsequent, Vietnam being the most predominant, where you heard about the vets treated coming home, but not so much about World War II.
Jim, I think you were next.
Okay, yeah. One of the pieces in the film that I thought showed something is that Homer was very happy that he was getting a good disability pension from the government. So they were at least treating some people reasonably. And then also the fact that Al was in charge of loans for GIs, and they were supposedly government guaranteed, but his bank didn't care about that a whole lot. But anyway, there was some support there. I want to go a little bit where Sue was too. My father was also a World War II veteran, but he absolutely never wanted to talk about the war. It was a topic that you don't express. So, but he came back. He got his job back that he had before.
Bill, I think you were next, and then Chuck, and then I have a couple chats after that too.
Yeah, a couple things. There truly was an isolationist element in the American public from what I have read. It was definitely a minority opinion, but it was strong enough where there was a lot of resistance to entering the war until Pearl Harbor happened, and then everybody got on board immediately or nearly everybody, certainly popular opinion did, but that isolationist strain was there. And amongst some of the population, it was always there even throughout the war, from what I've read. I agree with Jim on the previous points he made about, I really think Wyler, being a veteran himself, was trying to make a case for these veterans that were having a hard time. And I think it was almost as though he was speaking through Al in terms of, well, yeah, we have to, as a banker, I have to be aware of things like collateral, et cetera, but we can't thoroughly dismiss the idea of character, particularly from people who have been through it and given so much for their country. And I think that was something that was near and dear to Wyler. That's the read I get on it.
All right, and then Chuck, it was you after Bill.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things I kind of thought about was, I just thought about there was kind of a disconnect between the attitudes of the people on the home front and then what the soldiers coming home actually experience. For a lot of people who did not go to war and stayed home on the home front the whole time, they weren't aware of probably what the soldiers went through. And when the war was over, they were ready to move on. They had heard about it maybe on the radio or newspapers for a long time. And the soldiers coming home, they still were working through issues of the horrors that they experienced. So that's, I kind of thought about when I was watching it, that the way they were treated, as in part, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Jeff, you had your hand up.
Just Chuck makes a good point there, and I just wanted to follow up on that, pertaining especially to Al's speech at his banquet, where Al is a well-educated and professional man, a bank manager, but in the war he was an infantryman. So it's to be assumed he probably saw some bad stuff. So I think that was kind of his way of pushing it back into the faces of these guys who were at home. Like, we had to go get this hill and we didn't have any collateral, but nonetheless we have to do it. So that was a little bit of a, this is what I've been through, and you guys can't possibly understand that. And that was one of my favorite parts of that film, was him in a slightly drunken state, kind of laying it out there to the banking stuff shirts. And I also wanted to mention about Fred's character, the polar opposite, a guy who was from the wrong side of the tracks, grew up poor, but in the war, I think a couple of times the fighters are called the glamour boys. It was like a high profile and important job. But when he's having the interview at the soda shop, he realized that those skills that he had aren't worth anything back home now. Like, I just dropped bombs, and the guy's trying to help him. He said, well, did you command people? Did you do procurement, anything like that? He said, no, I just dropped bombs. And it's very poignant and sad that he realizes that this skill that he had, which was so vital during war, is completely useless to him now. It has no status now in peacetime. So.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm glad you mentioned, well, both of those scenes, but particularly the banquet scene, because the first time you watch this film, you don't know where this is going to go. You don't know if he's just going to come off as a drunken rambler. But the thing about it is, I think he realizes during that speech that nobody in this room understands what I've just said. Maybe a couple of people, but he comes to that self-realization. It's as sobering for him as it is to the people that really grab a hold of that. Great points. And I lost track. Veronica, who's next?
Real quick, Andy, before we take anyone else, I just want to get caught up in the chat real quick.
Oh, okay. And I think maybe Bob is after the chat, maybe.
Yes, and
Okay.
then I Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Oh,
I was
okay,
like, I know
thanks.
someone else right there, and I lost track. So in the chat, Jerry said that the movie had the best ending ever. And she also said that the film surprised her and made her wonder about the GI Bill and housing. Maribel said that they were the silent generation and that folks didn't complain as much as we do now.
Well, that's probably true.
And then Martha said that she's heard that some women who entered the home front workforce resented being pressured to give up their jobs to
Mhm.
returning servicemen. And that didn't come up in the film, but when the banker's wife seemed so sad to give up her planned social evening when he came home unexpectedly, it made her think of similar situations for currently deployed service members. The parent who stays home gets used to a routine that gets upset a bit when the service member comes back and there's a period of adjustment. And Debbie says that they didn't have social media.
Yeah, well, thank goodness for them. I wish we didn't sometimes. Yeah, all great points. And I definitely want to talk more about the women in this film and women in general during this time. But I'm going to go to, let's see, I think we had Bob
It was
next.
Bob and then Bill.
Okay.
I wanted to go back for a moment to the disparity in the ranks of Frederick March and Dana Andrews. March was not a low-level infantryman. He was almost a sergeant major. He had 5 stripes, two rockers. That's senior, and so he was promoted to a position of real power in the non-commissioned officer ranks, which I knew of. One of my childhood friends his father was in a similar position. He had volunteered to go in, but he had also negotiated a rank, and I'm confident that's what happened to Frederick March. Dana Andrews would have to have been a competent guy who had demonstrated some skill in bombardier training, and those guys had to be officers, and it didn't matter where this guy had come from or what his background, however seedy or stupid it might have been. If he could put a bomb on a target, that was all they needed and all that was required.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Bill,
Okay,
you were
was it Bill Schneider, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
sorry. I know there are multiple Bills.
that's okay.
All right. We were talking about Fred and the drugstore and the job interview. It also came out there that the guy who had been his understudy is now the more senior guy. He obviously didn't go into the service, and that was probably a real situation that a lot of veterans had to face of the shock of coming back and finding out that all the people who were behind there, and you're now the low man on the totem pole when you used to be this more senior guy. I know my father was in World War II, and he had worked at a steel mill. He came back to work at a steel mill, but I don't know if he ever, whether he experienced that or not when he came back. I know he had a job and stuff, but I don't know if he had to go through finding out that others who hadn't had to go were in better positions because of not having to go.
Yeah, I'm sure it happened an awful lot. Well, I want to talk about the women, but before I do, obviously this film is not a film noir, but it does have several elements that we will see in film noir, even those that happened before the war. One of the big themes in noir is returning servicemen not knowing how to adjust to civilian life. And you see that with characters that come back with amnesia, or they come back and go a little bit crazy. And this is actually where the femme fatale came from. You've got these women who were staying at home or were raising the family, and when the men went off to war, a lot of them went to work, and a lot of the men came back, were not happy that their wives had to work. And some of these women attained positions of power that some of the men couldn't deal with. So this is kind of the seeds of the femme fatale in film noir. Now, again, this isn't a film noir. This is a drama, but it does have some of those elements. So That leads me to my next point is I want to talk about the women in this film who in a lot of ways are the unsung heroes. First, you've got characters Millie, played by Myrna Loy, Peggy, played by Teresa Wright, and Wilma, played by Kathy O'Donnell. Now, although these women didn't go to war, they really were warriors, especially once the men came home. The fearlessness, the courage they display in this movie is incredible. And you know that millions of women could identify with these performances. But I also want to mention two of the actresses. Playing Fred's wife, Fred's no good wife, Marie, is Virginia Mayo, who before this played strictly in light comedies. This was her first dramatic role. And that scene in the powder room with Teresa Wright is just tremendous. I mean, if she can do that, she can do anything. And then we've got Kathy O'Donnell. This is incredible. This was her first feature film, and she was playing opposite a non-actor, but not only a non-actor, but a non-actor with a disability. And her balanced performance, it conveys such a wide range of emotions without ever getting melodramatic. So let's talk a little bit about the women in the film, or just the women in post-World War II. What do you think? Let's hear some, and let's hear from some people we haven't heard from yet. That would be great.
Chris, go ahead.
Well, it's not really about the women, but the relationship with the men. I was surprised when the men were flying home, and they were talking about what they were going home to. And Al was, didn't seem real eager to get home. He said he'd been married 20 years. And whereas, what's his name, that was only been married 20 days was very eager to see his young wife. And when they got home, you know, Al's wife was the perfect wife. Millie was welcoming, and she was just so happy to see him. And Peggy was, you know, not, I don't know. It just was interesting. I'm not sure why Al was so reluctant to go home.
Mm-hmm.
Sue, I think you're next, and then we'll hear from Bill B.
Yeah, well, I love Virginia Mayo. I thought that was spectacular, but I also love Myrna Loy. She was just so stunning and so clever and so salty in a way, you know, just rolling the eyes. Oh, I loved it. And she kept rescuing this guy. You know, I kept wondering if was they ever going to make it? But I think they buy him at least. Yeah. And I do want to mention something that came back to me as we were talking. I was very young during World War II, but I remember women in my neighborhood working, and most of them ended up not working, but some had to keep working because their husband was killed, or and because their husband didn't return. But my uncle was in the Seabees, and he returned. And he literally looked like Dana Andrews, very charming and good looking. But he informed my mother, he was coming from San Diego to go to the East Coast. And he informed my mother that he was bringing his girlfriend. And my mother was trying to figure out where she was going to place everybody in what beds, because she had, and my mother got just in a tizzy. And there's two things about this. It turns out that they were married. And my mother was like so happy.
That solves that problem.
Yeah. And the other crazy thing is that he was in the Seabees, but apparently they discovered either then or earlier, and maybe he didn't tell them, but he had diabetes. So they actually made him the postmaster, so he didn't go out in combat. But anyway, it was like, you know, but when he came back, you know, it was just so amazing to see somebody in uniform and to be part of that. My father had medical reasons why he couldn't be there, but anyway, it was a very fascinating experience and very vivid. So I just thought I'd say, and you know, that these, like my aunt had given up her job in order to marry and go east. And it was a good choice. He found himself a really good girl, a good gal. But anyway, so I just think the women in that movie were great.
Yeah. And again, I think we tend to overlook the sacrifices that the women made.
Yeah.
Not only on the home front, but a lot of women who actually served as well, who they don't get enough attention either.
Yes, and I'd like to say there is a museum of women in the military,
Mhm.
which is down in Arlington Cemetery. It is fabulous because it shows women of all kinds, of all ways that they served in the military, and it is very stunning. So if you ever are in that area, you really should see it.
Definitely.
And
Okay.
next we had Bill, and then Oren, I saw you raise your hand, and then we'll have Jan.
Yeah, Andy, I totally agree with your observation about Kathy O'Donnell. I must say I was stunned that this was her first feature film, because that was a subtly difficult role,
Mm.
and she pulled it off beautifully. I thought all of the lead actresses were exceptional, and I have to say I can understand why Myrna Loy won Best Actress for that, because there was so much that wasn't really in the dialogue.
Mhm.
And I felt like there was a lot underneath the surface in the relationship with Al. And they made there was one scene where they talked about where Teresa Wright goes, "Oh, you guys have just had the most beautiful relationship." I said, "We've had lots and lots of ups and downs. How many times have I said I hated you? How many times I said I hated you?" I got the feeling just from that scene and from the ways that her character sort of rolled with the punches with Al's drinking and his behavior. She was always keeping it together. Like, hey, I've been here before. I know that this is a good man. We're going to figure this out. And her knowing looks, which I think she kind of perfected during the Thin Man series.
Mhm.
Do you remember?
Yeah, I do.
Remember that?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
she can convey so much in just a sideward glance or a particular subtle expression. But I felt like there was a lot going on between her and Al. And I think part of Al's trepidation of coming back, because of the three, it seemed like, hey, he's coming back into a wonderful situation. He's got this beautiful family. He's got a good job to go back to. But I think that there was something about the war and having to deal with things that were so real that, as we pointed out earlier, I think somebody pointed out that as a banker, he would have never seen.
Yeah.
And then he had this drinking problem. You don't really know whether that came before he left or if he acquired it while he was in a wartime situation under all kinds of stress.
Yeah.
But you could tell that there was this tremendous bond between he and Millie, but that it wasn't all roses. You know, they had gone through a lot together.
Absolutely. And you know, Millie is doing actually double duty, if not triple duty, because she's trying to adjust to her husband and bring him back into something normal. And she's also trying to keep her daughter, Peggy, from making a major mistake in her life. And, you know, we don't see that much of the son, but, you know, she's having to deal with all of that too. So she's really juggling a lot of things. And you bring up a good point also, Bill. You guys get tired of hearing me say it, but you can tell how good actors and actresses are by their eyes. You know, if you just watch their eyes, you can tell who is on it and who is not. And she is on it, definitely on it. I think Veronica, Oren was next. Is that right?
Oren was next, and then Jan.
Okay. Oren, you with us?
Ooh. Oren, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, it's actually, oops, I keep fading in and out. It's actually me that wants to talk,
Okay, Beth.
whether you can see me or not. But no, Bill basically said what I was going to say about the relationship between Millie and Al, which explains why Al was a little reluctant to go home, because he didn't really know what he was going to face. And clearly from Millie's statement, they'd had their ups and downs, but Bill really pretty much covered that.
Well, it reminds me of the words in the marriage vow, for better or for worse. They hadn't forgotten it.
There was a lot of worse in this film.
Also, I'm going to stick in my opinion of the perfect mate, perfect companion is somebody whose faults you can live with.
So true. Okay.
Jan, it was your turn.
Jan.
Yep.
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm, a little reticent to say I know more about this from the perspective of women than I do of men. And then as we're talking, I'm realizing my dad, who fought in the war, really didn't speak that much about it, but my mom did, who was Peggy in the movie. But another thing I wanted to mention, I stumbled on this a number of years ago, and I've seen it a few times since. I think it was more of a documentary. It was called Rosie the Riveter. And as I'm recalling, it profiled 4 women who went to work during World War II and their perspectives. And it was, that they had jobs, and they were more, well, riveter type jobs. I mean, they were the industrial making, heavy machinery type thing. Filling in when the men were off to war, and the reactions of them when the war was over, how they were expected to give up the jobs and go marry and have babies. Well, not all of them felt that way. Some of them liked working and making their own money. It's very interesting. It's a little obscure if you can find it, but it gives an interesting perspective of women in the exact era that we're talking about. It's called Rosie the Riveter.
Great. Thank you.
Bill, did you want to go ahead and share?
Well, I had a couple of things, but Jan just reminded me there was a show called Bletchley Circle about some women who had worked at Bletchley Park, which was the code breaking center in the UK during the war, who helped break the Enigma. And it followed the lives of some women who, after the war, not only did they not have their jobs anymore, but they couldn't even talk about what it is they had done. And so their families didn't know anything about what they've been doing. And they were brilliant women, and they were not allowed to talk or do anything. Just terrible, though. The story, of course, they go on and do some good things, in the show. But the other thing I want to mention is, we were talking about the families, so Al brings home souvenirs to give to his son. And I thought to myself, he's giving a samurai sword to this teenage boy, a flag with blood on it. I just not sure that would have been appropriate things to do for a teenage boy. I mean, I can understand why he'd bring those kind of things back, but I didn't. And then the boy didn't seem to be at least been interested in them anyhow. But I thought that was quite a shocking thing. And I thought maybe the samurai, we were watching this movie because of the 7 Samurai movie we watched in the summer, and Al and Andy wanted a subtle connection and stuff. But
we're coming full circle. That's right.
Jim, did I see you raise your hand?
Oh, just wanted to comment. I thought that the person that played Al's son was probably the worst actor I've ever seen in a major movie.
Well, you notice he didn't get much screen time. That could be why. I don't know if he was ever in anything else. I did not look him up. Probably for that reason. Yeah,
I did, and he had bit parts like once a year in something. So
okay, so he kept working for a while.
Jackie, you were next, and then I see you, Sue.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. You hadn't mentioned it yet, but one of the scenes I like the most, because I kind of like planes, is the end scene where where they're in the B-17 graveyard, the huge, you pan back and you see everything's taking apart, they're taking off the engines, they're dismantling everything, and then you see the scale of how much things are taken without words. That kind of says a little bit about it. And for those of you who remember one of my favorite movies, was the one with Marty McFly? I don't remember the name of it.
Back to the Future.
So yeah, so you kind of put those two together. Here's the junk man taking the planes apart. Hey, do you need a job? See, ask Gus if you could use it. And he's building Marty McFly's house in the Lyon Estates, the next valley over, right? Because that's when the suburb starts. That's that whole suburb thing starts. Just one goes right into the 50s, right into the 50s from there. So pretty funny.
Yeah, Back to the Future connection. I did not see that coming.
Yeah, I like planes.
Sue, you were next.
Two things. I actually agree, Jackie, that I love that whole scene. It was so spectacular. It just really, that and the speech was one part of it, but that visual of what all of this was just now gone was so spectacular. I do want to put in a plug. I really love seeing Hoagie Carmichael.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's it has anything to do with anything, but I thought it was very cool.
Yeah, I love Hoagie Carmichael, and he's wonderful in this. He should own a bar somewhere, and we should all go to it.
Yes, right.
Andy, real quick before you continue, there are a couple things going on in the chat.
Okay.
Jay says that Myrna Loy's restrained performance is one of her best.
Mm-hmm.
That the looks between her and Frederick March speak volumes. And Bernadette and Wale were wondering how long was Al away in the war?
Okay. And Jay, thank you for sharing that with us. And yeah, Myrna Loy certainly was just fabulous, certainly deserving of all the awards that she got for this. I don't know that we ever learned exactly how long Al was away in the war. I don't know if he was away for the entire war. I'm not sure that they say. From the way that he returns and almost doesn't recognize his children, I would say it was probably quite a while, maybe 4 years.
I thought one of the kids said something about a lot happens in 2 years.
Was it 2?
I don't know. Maybe I made that up, but
I may be mistaken. You may be right. Yeah.
And Martha also asked if anyone else was surprised to see Fred walk not only under the wing, but then all the way under the plane in the beginning. And she wants to know where the military advisor was. And Gary says that Hoagie Carmichael was the model for James Bond per Ian Fleming.
I've heard that. Mm-hmm.
And Debbie says that the scene where the father of Dana Andrews' character reads the letter about his son's bravery is a tearjerker.
Oh yeah. That's one of the great little moments in the film that, again, so many people in the audience could relate to. And they had to have handed out boxes of Kleenex at the showings of this film. They just had to. I can bear, and I'm actually glad I didn't show this in front of an audience, because I would have been weeping the entire time. But yeah, those are great points. Well, I want to. I think Bob.
Sorry, Bob raised his hand.
Yeah.
You were just talking about how a lot of this information would have been inside baseball too, or at least every member of the audience would know what is being said. And I thought that was particularly funny. Hoagie Carmichael played Hoagie Carmichael in every movie he ever made. And when somebody asked him, could you play, Up a Lazy River? Could you play that? He said, yeah. Well, he should have known it because he wrote it. And everybody in the audience would have known that.
Yeah, he's great. I wish he'd been in more movies, but the ones he's in it's a great role. Anything he's in is great. So I wanted to move over a little bit and talk about Harold Russell. And we talked a little bit about him. Bill had a great story about him. Wow, I wish I could have been there for that, Bill. But casting him, a real disabled veteran was not only realism, it was a stroke of genius. But you know, most Americans who didn't serve in the war, as I mentioned earlier, probably had never seen a disability like Homer's, at least not to this degree. And again, the production code was against showing Homer without his hooks, but Weiler persisted. For the people who were seeing somebody like Homer for the first time, what do you think the impact was for those audience members?
Debbie? And then Wale, I saw your hand too.
Well, I would think that it would be very emotionally, it would have a very deep emotional impact for most people back then, because when I was growing up, the Vietnam War was taking place and it was right on our TV sets. And so we had more, I think, as a child, I had more exposure to the horrors of war through television than most people would have had at home during that time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it would have been pretty devastating.
Yeah. We've seen so much of it now, and especially and a lot of that started with Vietnam. We saw, I mean, it came into our living rooms every night, but World War II was different.
Yeah.
Even if you watched a lot of newsreels, you didn't see much like that.
Really, I mean, I think the newsreels were more for, you know, kind of like boosting morale at home, kind of like, here's what we're doing stuff.
Yeah.
It didn't focus on things like post-traumatic stress disorder, a term that you'll hear now all the time. And we know about these things now. And another thing that shocked me was I had no idea that there was so much isolationism back then. I didn't really appreciate that. When I saw this movie, I was shocked by the way they treated the veterans. And it just underscored how that difference between actually living through the war and being at home, maybe hearing about it in letters or something. But it was like a history lesson for me, in addition to being a great movie.
Yeah, good. There's a book that we may get to next week when we talk about books on movies that addresses some of those issues that I do plan to bring up. Let's see, Veronica, I think we had Wale next.
Wale was next, and then I've got everyone else, I promise.
Okay, thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so first I want to say, yeah, it was a really good movie. It was generally low stakes, you know, a movie that is very powerful without any explosions or death.
Like you said.
No chase scenes.
No chase scenes. No, even the romantic scenes were not. How will I put them? They didn't like take. They didn't hog all the limelight. You know, it was. You just basically followed some people around and saw a glimpse of what their life was like, and you got the message. Nobody had to preach. It wasn't preachy. You got the message that the filmmakers were trying to portray. Now, the director decided to show what he knows. You know, there was a lot of authenticity with the movie. So yeah, they got Harold to play the disabled character. I think that helped with the authenticity, and it helped humanize disabled people and show that they are just as human as everybody else. I think that was the real power of casting Harold as Homer. Initially, I thought maybe there was a bit of a gimmick to the casting. You know, he saw Harold in a documentary and was like, I need to feature this guy. But I think watching the movie to the end, I got to realize how effective Harold was at showing all the nuances of being disabled. First of all, I suspect back then in Hollywood, they weren't really so keen on showing minorities or characters that were not exactly very beautiful. So there's a chance, I suspect, that they weren't showing disabled characters. They definitely weren't casting them, giving them many lines to speak and giving them love interest and stuff like that, or friendships, regular friendships with regular people. But that's exactly what these people go through. They have friendships, they have love lives, they have wants, they have needs. And Harold perfectly humanized that character. Now, I don't think his acting was that great. Personally, I don't even think he was acting. I think he was just being himself. I don't think he acted a single second in that movie. So I personally wouldn't have given him an Oscar for acting. I believe he deserved the Oscar, the honorary Oscar he got, because of his bravery and his effectiveness at doing what he eventually did for disabled people all over the world, and for veterans coming back home. I think I've spoken for too long.
No, no, that's totally fine. And you bring up some great points. And the sad part about Hollywood is it still has problems with diversity. We still don't have enough diverse characters. You look, and the same thing with disabled characters. You look at a movie like Wonder. If you saw that movie based on a very popular book for young people, they didn't get a disabled actor to play that role. They did it with CGI and makeup, which totally destroyed the movie for me. So, and we have the same problems with race issues, being, not getting the right actor, right, not getting the right actor with the right ethnicity. It's still a problem with Hollywood. So we've made some strides, but not enough.
I'll quickly mention this movie, The Week Off by Adam Sandler. It starred Adam Sandler and Chris Rock. Now, most people don't watch Adam Sandler movies, but this particular film, he cast someone without legs to play an elderly person who lost his legs in the war. And I think that was a really, really good thing he did. And the person did a really good job playing that part. I just thought I should mention that.
Yeah, no, thank you for doing that. So a couple of things, Bill, I see you. A couple of things about Harold Russell. Yeah, he definitely was not an actor. And you can see there are certain scenes that he's better in than others. And I think one of his worst scenes is the opening when the three men are in the plane and they're flying home. He just does not sound natural. And that was one of the first scenes that he shot. But the scene where he confronts the guy at the soda counter, boy, that's incredible. And some of the scenes with Kathy O'Donnell are very, very good. So I think we had to cut him some slack in some ways. Some of the people that didn't cut him some slack were Frederick March. And if you do a little research, you'll hear about this story where they're in the bar and Homer is using his hooks to pour the beer. And there was one person on the set that said that Frederick March said to him, "Stop using those damn hooks. People are supposed to be focusing on what I'm saying, not you pouring your beer," which is a horrendous thing to do. I mean, I love Frederick March, but he blew it on that one. But Harold Russell actually got into some other controversy too. He actually sold one of his Oscars later in life, which you are just never supposed to do. And of course, again, you could probably cut him some slack because he's not an actor. He doesn't know that thing and know all of that. But he did appear in other movies. You can look at his IMDb page. And one of the things that I really admired about him, and I don't really watch the Oscars anymore, so I don't know if they still do this, but they used to bring on all the people that had ever won an Oscar who were still alive for the program. And Harold Russell was almost always there. I mean, even into his 80s, I think he was on just about every one of those things. So, here's a guy that's trying to fit into a Hollywood world that he, is really not fit for. But, thank God he was in this movie. It did so much for veterans, disabled veterans especially. So I can't imagine this movie without him in it. Okay, I talked too long. Who do we have?
All good. Andy, we have a list.
Okay, we have a list. Okay.
Vanessa is first, and then Oren is after.
Okay.
And then there are more.
Okay, great. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I have rather a personal story. So for me, I've always watched or loved old movies, always. And Andy knows this about me. But the first time I watched this film, I was quite young. I probably was around 10 or 11 years old. And it was the first time I had ever seen someone with a disability on screen in an old movie. I mean, I had never seen that before. And as a child, I almost wondered, is that real? Like, is he really missing his hands, or is it just like makeup or a prop? So as I kept watching this film, it really gave me a sense of how I viewed people with disabilities and the empathy that I developed towards them. And I swear to God, it shaped my entire life, because it forced me to recognize that these people are just as human as we are, and they deserve our respect. And they should not be treated any differently than anyone else just because they have a disability. So yeah, this movie stands out as changing my life and how I view people. And I'm so thankful for it. And I'm so thankful that Wyler insisted on casting Harold Russell in this role.
Vanessa, you're getting me as teared up as I would be watching the movie again. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was wonderful.
Oren was next, and then Jackie.
Mute me.
There you are.
Just unmuted me.
Okay, well, but she did the same time I did.
All right.
You too.
I just put most of my thoughts in a chat, but I'm going to say it again anyway. Two subjects. One is isolationism. It was prominent before the war. And of course, Pearl Harbor sort of turned people around on that. However, Charles Lindbergh, if you remember that name, he was a very strong isolationist. And he wound up offering or contributing a great deal of assistance to the Air Corps. Matter of fact, he taught them how to get the range out of their P-38 so that they could fly out and intercept and shoot down Admiral Yamamoto. So it was partly because of his contribution that they were able to do that. Yeah. On the other hand, not on the other hand, but a slightly related subject, there was a group called the American Bund, which was the Nazi sympathizers in the US before and during the war. We don't hear a whole lot about Nazi sympathizers in the war, but there were some. And you want to dig up some information on that, it's there. And it also broke my heart to see acres and acres and acres of B-17s sitting out in the field. You can't say rusting, aluminum doesn't rust, but sitting in the field and rotting. If I'd been there with a few $100s in my pocket, I could have made millions just by scooping up all the parts from those things. Because what used to be called the Confederate Air Force still has one flying. And getting parts for them is still a hard job. Anyway, said my piece. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jackie, you were next, and then Bob, and then Bill B. Oh, did Jackie leave?
Oh, maybe she may come back.
Okay.
Let's hope she does.
We'll
Okay,
put a pin in it. But Bob was next, and then Bill B.
Okay.
the directors of the Academy didn't think Harold Russell had any better chance of winning that supporting actor nomination than we did. But so they had arranged this second kind of Thalberg Award for support. So I'm still, if they made 7 remakes of this movie, whoever's playing that role will win the best Oscar for supporting actor every single time. I mean, it's actor proof, and Harold Russell proved it. It's still a wonderful role, though.
I think it's called actually the Harold Russell syndrome, because you look at the number of people who have won an Oscar for portraying somebody with a disability, and it goes long. I mean, you can find tons of them. I think it's actually called the Harold Russell syndrome or something like that.
And next was Bill B.
Yeah, I wanted to just very quickly revisit, Andy, your question about how audiences at the time would have reacted to Harold Russell's, that scene with Harold Russell and he takes his hooks off. And I think that was a very brave scene for Wyler to do at that time. I know Debbie talked about growing up in the Vietnam era. Like I'm a little older, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and people were very, very squeamish about seeing disabilities. And I remember people would, to a large extent, try to hide away. And the fact that he wanted to put it out there and say, hey, this is real, and this is a real person. And just because he has a disability, he is not his disability. So, yeah, I think Vanessa's statements were, I think, exactly what Wyler was going for. So I thought that was beautiful.
And I think Wyler made a really smart move. And if you remember earlier in the film, Homer is getting ready for bed and his dad helps him take the hooks off, but we don't see the stumps then. And then later when Kathy O'Donnell helps him with it, it's almost like the audience is saying, okay, I'm prepared for this now. And it's a little bit easier to deal with.
Wally, you have your hand up, and then Jim, I saw you raise your hand too.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly mention about the Oscars that go to people who play disabilities. I think my suspicion is it's because disabilities make it more obvious that the actor is acting. They make it more obvious that they make the actor's performance more obvious, because a lot of people voting or watching don't necessarily differentiate many actors' performances from their real characters. So when an actor performs against type, when they perform a character that is hard to recognize, or a character that is not associated with their person, they're more likely to be seen as acting. So I think that's why it's easier for them to win awards for playing disabled characters. Like Tom Hanks wins when he plays someone who's dumb. Holly Hunter wins for playing a deaf mute. I think Tom Cruise got nominated for 4th of July. I can't remember if he was nominated or if. So yeah, there's so many examples of. I think what's his name? Jamie Foxx. I think he won for playing.
Ray Charles. Yeah, Ray Charles.
Yeah. So it just makes it obvious. The work they put in becomes more obvious when they play disabled characters. So my point is they won it for a different reason than Harold, because Harold was playing himself.
Right.
I think Harold won because of the immense amount of courage it took to play and film those scenes, and because of the amount of difference he was making to the public psyche at that time.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you are.
Jim, did you want to share?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Andy to elaborate a little bit more on how you could not follow the production code and but I did see you mentioned that that Al and his wife were supposed to be in twin beds. It looked to me like they actually were sleeping in twin beds pushed together. But still, the fact that they said, "Oh, you can't have somebody show his stumps," and he said, "Nah, I want to do it anyway." And I always thought that it was fairly strict.
Yeah, there was some give and take on things. I mean, there were certain things that you certainly could not show. You could not show obviously any kind of sexual scene that was beyond kissing or hugging, or if it went very far beyond that, you could not show, and you couldn't talk about things like abortion, that type of thing, and you could not show a crime that was not punished. Things like that. So basically it was things of a sexual nature or that type of thing. So I think the bed putting together was kind of a compromise. And I think too, there were a lot of negotiations that went on then and still go on now to get like an R rating or a PG rating, although ratings are largely meaningless now, but because everything's streaming. But I think that they had such respect for Wyler and his years of service and the film itself that they were probably willing to forego some of the things as long as it wasn't an egregious breaking of the production code. But I think the thing they were most concerned about was Harold Lloyd. They just did not know how audiences were going to do that. And I think Wyler just said, "Look, trust me on this. You'll be glad you did it." And again, this was a groundbreaking moment. Here's a real guy with a real disability, and I think he probably just won over the censors. That's probably exactly what happened.
That was Harold Russell, not Harold Lloyd.
Sorry, did I say Harold Lloyd?
Yes.
Totally different guy. Although he did have a disability as well. He lost a finger during a movie.
Andy, before you go on, there's a lot of action going on in the chat.
Sure.
So Jerry, I know she had to go, but she wanted to share that she hoped that casting someone with an actual disability made those who are not as welcoming to realize what was sacrificed in the war. Debbie said that there was a definite subtext that family values matter. And Jerry said that she really agreed with that she lived through how returning Vietnam veterans were treated, but really thought World War II veterans were treated better than what the movie showed. And so she said that she wished that her dad was still here so she could let him know and thank him. Gary wanted to know if Dana Andrews drinking was a factor in this movie or not yet.
Probably. Dana Andrews, for those who don't know, had I won't say a lifetime drinking problem, but he had a long history of drinking problems. Actually, he was one of the first Hollywood actors to actually go public and say, "I had a drinking problem." He did a series of commercials, which I remember seeing one as a young person where he's talking about, I'm an alcoholic, I'm struggling with this. So I don't know for certain if he had a problem while shooting this film. I'm sure he, I don't know when his alcoholism began, but I'm sure this was part of that era. I don't know more about it. I wish I could be more specific.
Wale said that he loves how the film was also realistic about marriage, not being a lovey-dovey butterflies thing where there are no struggles, that the film is packed with a lot of subtlety and realism. Jay said that they want to give a shout out for Hugo Friedhofer's Academy Award winning score.
Yes.
And that it's Copeland-esque. I hope I'm saying that right. Bear with me as I read through comments. The opening credits are thematically evocative of the American spirit, and it segues seamlessly once the credits end to a lower key. nostalgia-provoking motif that accompanies the returning veterans' flight over the heartland. There is also the moment where Dana Andrews is sitting solo in the cockpit of the semi-dismantled plane, where the increasingly percussive score conveys the emotion building within him as he relives a wartime moment.
Yeah. Jay, I'm so glad you brought that up. The Friedhofer score is a terrific score. And if you watch a lot of classic movies, you'll find out that some of the composers, some of the film composers in the 1940s, including Friedhofer, are just tremendous. Max Steiner, Dmitri Tiomkin, I think, was a little bit later. There are so many great composers. And what he's talking about Copland-esque is he's referring to Aaron Copland, one of America's greatest composers, who actually did some film music as well. And I agree, it does have that Copland-esque feel to it. And yeah, this is one of those wonderful, wonderful scores that takes a great movie and makes it even greater. So yeah, great comment, Jay.
It's almost as if you have a degree in music.
Yeah, if only I had a degree in music.
And then we had one more comment from Wale that the audience reaction to Harold probably helped sway the censors.
Yeah, it could be that they saw a preview version of this before the censors were able to, you know, they made them put their knives away, you know, so to speak. Is there more in the chat?
That was it. And Gary
That
said
was
that
it.
he had to leave. So we lost Gary and Jerry.
Okay. All right. So I know we're going a little bit over our time, but you know, this is such a tremendous film, and I hesitate to end the discussion. So, but I know we are getting pretty late. People have things to do. So before we close, let me give you a couple of recommendations, and they're just a couple. And my first recommendation is not a movie, but a book that I spoke about earlier in the program, Five Came Back, a story of Hollywood and the Second World War by Mark Harris, which tells the story of 5 directors who served in the war: John Ford, Frank Capra, John Huston, George Stevens, and William Wyler. And we do have this book in the library system. It's a great book for anybody that's interested in movies, World War II, or both. It's like a page turner. It's just like a novel. It's so good and so well researched. And speaking of Frank Capra, he made a series of government films called Why We Fight, an Oscar-winning 7-part documentary. I've only seen parts of these series, but I plan on watching the whole thing. They were really groundbreaking for their time. It's kind of like the forerunner of a Ken Burns documentary. It's different than a Ken Burns documentary, obviously, because it was made, you know, decades before Ken Burns ever thought about making these. But these are films well worth seeing, called Why We Fight. It's a 7-part documentary, and all of those films are on Canopy. Okay, any final words before we call it a night? Okay, Bill.
The opening scene where they're all trying to get home reminded me of the story my mother would tell about my father, who he was discharged on the West Coast from the Navy. He had the choice of getting a train back or flying back. When I spent some time living in England, my mother would say, he took the train to come back to me. I don't know if he'll fly over the ocean to see you.
That's great. That's great. Okay, Jan, I think you have.
I quick Googled the documentary. It's Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter. It's from 1980.
1980. Okay, good.
And there were a couple more comments in the chat. Wally said that you mentioned Capra and that this movie beat It's a Wonderful Life at the Oscars, and that's really impressive.
Yeah.
And Jay said that there are 2 much darker returning from Vietnam films, Coming Home and The Deer Hunter.
Yeah, both of those are excellent films. Both of those are hard watches. but well worth seeing. Yeah, Jay is right on that. You know, It's a Wonderful Life didn't win any Oscars, and you know, you have to wonder what would have happened if The Best Years of Our Lives had not come out that year. But the thing about It's a Wonderful Life is it was not a box office hit. It didn't make money. It was made by Republic Pictures, who we talked about last time as one of the Poverty Row studios. They did put a lot of money behind it, but really nobody went to see that film. It only became hugely popular when it played on cable TV in the 80s. But yeah, who knows what would have happened? What if? All right. Well, is that the? Oh, is there one more, Veronica? Two more?
Nope, that was it. I was just
That was
saying
it.
It's a Wonderful Life is one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, I love it. I love that film.
Oh, Bill B, did I see your hand come up? Oh,
I think he was just
I
giving
was
the thumbs
just
up.
giving it a thumbs up. But Andy's absolutely right. It's a Wonderful Life was not very well received when it came out, which is amazing to me. And as Andy said, I think it wasn't until it fell by accident into public domain, and it showed all the time for a while, and people saw it and say, "Wow, where's this been?"
Yeah, it's tremendous. Well, again, thank you guys for sticking with me, especially running a little bit late. We didn't make it the length of time of the movie, but this has been a great conversation, and thank you for joining me tonight. And please remember to honor our veterans, not just on Veterans Day, but all the time. And I hope to see you next week with Raquel Stetcher talking about some great movie books. So everybody take care. Be safe.
Thanks for recommending this.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Take care. Thanks for joining us.